Lake Mead is at 1,041.10 feet above sea level this morning. 27% full, holding 7,053,590 acre-feet against a capacity of 26,120,000, and roughly half a foot above the lowest level ever recorded since the reservoir first filled in the 1930s. Dead pool at Hoover Dam, the elevation at which water can no longer pass through it at all, is 895 feet. That leaves 146 feet. The Bureau of Reclamation projects the lake at 1,037.31 feet by December 31st, below the July 2022 record. Today is Sunday, August 2nd, 2026. Here is the rest of it. Lake Mead has fallen 3.39 feet in the past month and 13.04 feet in the past year. System-wide storage across the Colorado River sits near 33%. Upstream, Lake Powell is at 3,521.888 feet in 22. 1% full, having taken in 2% of its average monthly inflow last month. The Colorado River supplies roughly 40 million people. And 2026 is shaping up to be the worst hydrologic year on record for this basin. Now, one correction before we go anywhere because it changes the shape of the answer. There are 7 Colorado River Basin states, not 10: Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and California. The 8th party is Mexico, which is not a state and receives its water under a 1944 treaty administered separately. And Hoover Dam does not reach all 7. It reaches 3 of them directly. Hoover regulates Colorado River flows, stores water, and produces hydroelectric power for Nevada, California, and Arizona. Those 3 states plus Mexico are the parties that take water from below the dam. The other 4, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, are upstream. The water in Lake Mead is there because those 4 sent it down. So if you are picturing a map where a dying Hoover Dam turns 10 states brown at once, that is not the mechanism. What actually happens is that the basin splits into 2 entirely different failure modes, and the second one is the part almost nobody covers. Let me start with what the dam actually does, because it fails in stages rather than all at once. Hoover Dam does 3 jobs. It stores water behind it in Lake Mead. It regulates the flow of the Colorado River downstream, releasing on a schedule to meet delivery obligations. And it generates hydroelectric power. Those 3 jobs stop at 3 different elevations. The first is around 1,050 feet, the upper gates of the dam's intake towers, historically treated as the practical floor for reliable generation. Lake Mead has been below that line for some time. The second is 950 feet. The Bureau of Reclamation calls this the inactive pool. It is the minimum elevation at which Hoover Dam can generate power at all, even after the turbine upgrades completed around 2015 and 2016 lowered that threshold. Below it, the turbines stop. Water can still be released, it just passes through without producing electricity. That is a serious event for 3 states' power supply. It is not yet a water supply crisis. The third is 895 feet, dead pool. This is the elevation of the dam's lowest outlets, and below it, water physically cannot pass through Hoover by gravity. The reservoir stops being a reservoir and becomes a plug. Nothing goes downstream, not to Arizona, not to California, not to Mexico. And there is a 4th figure almost nobody mentions, 849 feet dead storage, below which no release downstream is possible under any circumstance at all. Between 895 and 849, there is water in the lake and it cannot get out. So Lake Mead this morning sits 91 feet above losing its power and 146 feet above losing its ability to deliver water. Now here is a comparison worth making because it tells you which failure arrives first in this system, and it is not the one in the title. Upstream, Lake Powell is 3,521.88 feet. Glen Canyon Dam's minimum power pool is 3,490. That is 31.88 feet of margin. Hoover has 91 feet. Glen Canyon has 32. So Glen Canyon Dam is roughly 3 times closer to losing its generation than Hoover Dam is. Reclamation warned in April that Lake Powell could fall below minimum power pool by August without major intervention, and it is August. If a dam in this system stops making electricity this year, it will be the one upstream, not the one in this video's title. That matters for Hoover in a way that is not obvious, because the 2 reservoirs are one system. Lake Mead is filled almost entirely by releases from Lake Powell. And to protect Powell's turbines, this year's release to Mead was cut from a projected 7,480,000 acre-feet down to 6 million Syrian. Every acre-foot held back to save the upstream dam is one that does not arrive at the downstream one. Reclamation is currently managing that trade-off, and there is not enough water to fully protect both. Now, if you are watching from Ohio or Georgia or somewhere in New England, this reaches you in 3 ways that have nothing to do with your tap. Food, Colorado River water irrigates the farmland, producing the overwhelming majority of North America's winter leafy greens in California's Imperial Valley and around Yuma, Arizona, that arrives on your receipt in January. Power. Hoover and Glen Canyon feed an interconnected western grid, and hydropower is dispatchable. It ramps within minutes to balance supply that increasingly comes from solar that stops at sunset and wind that comes and goes. Losing that flexibility changes the cost and stability of power across a region. And people. If you have family in Phoenix, Tucson, or Las Vegas, this is their supply and their utility bill. So here is the structure. First, the parties below the dam in the order they actually lose water. Then the 4 states above it who lose something else. And hold on to one thing while we go, because I am coming back to it. Hoover Dam's electricity is used in part to move Hoover Dam's water. That circularity is the least understood mechanism in this entire system, and it is why a falling reservoir raises water bills before it ever empties a tap. Below the dam, the order is set by seniority, not by geography, population, or need. The oldest legal claim is served in full before the newest gets a drop. Arizona is the most exposed party on the Colorado River, and it is not close. Under the Tier 1 shortage in force for calendar year 2026, Arizona gives up 512,000 acre-feet, roughly 18% of its entire Colorado River supply, and about 30% of what moves through its canal. Under a Tier 2 shortage, it gives up 592,000. The reason is a single agreement from 1968. Congress authorized the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile canal carrying water from Lake Havasu across the desert to Phoenix and onto Tucson, supplying 19 cities and towns. California had the political weight to block that authorization, and it had a condition Central Arizona Project water would be junior in priority to California's Colorado River deliveries. Permanently, Arizona agreed, because without it there was no canal. Under federal law, junior rights created after 1968 must be reduced before California's older rights are touched at all. That is the whole explanation for why the numbers land the way they do. And inside Arizona, the priority system nests again. Within the Central Arizona Project's service area, tribal rights sit at the top, cities and industry next, non-tribal agriculture at the bottom. The agricultural pool lost 65% of its allocation in 2022, was cut off entirely in 2023, and remained at 0 in 2024. Tribal users over the same period took no cuts in 2022 and reductions of 7% and 6% after. Mexico is second. Its 1,500,000 acre-foot allocation supplies the Mexicali Valley, among the most productive agricultural regions in the country. And municipal water for Tijuana, Mexicali, and Ensenada. Under Tier 1, it gives up 80,000 acre-feet. Under Tier 2, 104,000. In the shortage models being run for post-2026 operations, Mexico's share appears at roughly 16 2/3% of every tier, though the modelers stress those are assumptions and actual deliveries are negotiated through the International Boundary and Water Commission with the State Department. Mexico sits second for a structural reason. It is at the absolute end of the pipe. Every drop it receives has already passed every American user, and it has the least leverage of any party, not a signatory to the compact, not at the 7-state table, with a remedy that runs through diplomacy rather than a domestic court. In most recent years, the Colorado River has not reached the sea at all. Nevada is third, and it is the strangest case in the system. Nevada holds the smallest apportionment on the river, 300,000 acre-feet, about 4% of the lower basin total, set in an era when almost nobody lived there. More than 75% of the state's population is now in greater Las Vegas, and Lake Mead supplies roughly 90% of southern Nevada's water. On paper, that is the most exposed position in the basin. In practice, Nevada is the best protected of anyone, and here is why. Every other major municipal user in the lower basin takes delivery below Hoover Dam. Southern Nevada takes its water out of Lake Mead itself above the dam. And beginning in 2008, it built intake number 3, the third straw, a deep tunnel that began delivering water in September 2015. Paired with a low lake level pumping station able to draw down to around 875 feet. Dead pool at Hoover Dam is 895. So in the scenario where Lake Mead falls below 895 and nothing passes the dam, Southern Nevada could still be drawing water out of the lake. The state with the smallest allocation on the river is the one with physical access when the dam stops working. Nevada also used just 212,400 acre-feet in 2024 against its 300,000 entitlement. And in 2023, Southern Nevada used less Colorado River water than in any of the previous 31 years while its population grew. Its Tier 1 cut is 21,000 acre-feet, the smallest of any party. I do not want to oversell that. A deeper intake does not create water. At 880 feet, the Colorado has effectively collapsed as a functioning supply, and Nevada would be drawing from a shrinking pond while every economy it trades with had already failed. Nevada's advantage is measured in time, not in safety. But the time is real, and it was bought deliberately at a cost of over $1 billion. California is fourth, holding the largest apportionment on the entire river at 4,400,000 acre-feet and the most senior rights in the lower basin. Under Tier 1 and Tier 2 alike, California's mandatory reduction is 0, not small. 0. There is an internal detail worth knowing. California's own rights are ranked among themselves, and the most senior belong to agriculture rather than cities. Principally the Imperial Irrigation District in the far southeast corner of the state, which holds one of the oldest and largest claims on the whole river. The Metropolitan Water District, which wholesales to Los Angeles, San Diego, and much of the coastal south, sits junior to those agricultural districts inside California's own stack. So if California ever does absorb a mandatory cut, the newest large claim goes first, and in California that belongs to the cities, not the farms. And California's protection is contractual, not physical. The Colorado River Aqueduct draws from Lake Havasu, which is fed by releases through Hoover Dam. At dead pool, seniority becomes irrelevant because there is no water in the channel to be senior to. Southern California's real protection is the State Water Project out of Northern California, an alternative Arizona's canal-fed suburbs simply do not have. Now above the dam where the mechanism changes completely. Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico take no mandatory lower basin reduction. None. Dead pool at Hoover takes nothing from them directly. But they are exposed to something else, and it is called a compact call. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 divided the basin at a point called Lee Ferry, just below the Utah-Arizona line, apportioning 7,500,000 acre-feet a year to each half. The upper basin has an obligation to deliver water past that line. California's Colorado River Commissioner has put the combined obligation to the lower basin and Mexico at an average of 8,250,000 acre-feet a year and made the point that matters, that obligation is fixed in law even when the river produces less water. It does not shrink when the snowpack fails. So if the upper basin cannot meet it, the lower basin can make a compact call. A legal demand that Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico curtail their own use to satisfy the delivery. Under the 1948 Upper Basin Compact, the Upper Colorado River Commission would determine each state's extent and timing of curtailment. Wyoming holds 14% of the Upper Basin's share, with Colorado holding the largest portion, followed by Utah and then New Mexico. And here is why that is worse for those 4 states than anything in the Lower Basin's tiers. The lower basin's cuts are negotiated. They arrive in tiers, with warning, through a framework the states helped write, softened by conservation deals and compensated fallowing. A curtailment order is none of those things. It is imposed. It follows an obligation already missed. And it falls on junior rights inside those states, West Slope agriculture in Colorado, whatever the Central Utah Project cannot cover in Utah. It would also not arrive as a letter. The compact creates the obligation without fully describing the remedy, which means a compact call would be a lawsuit filed in the Supreme Court, which has original jurisdiction over disputes between states. Those take years. Arizona against California ran for 11 of them. So the practical consequence is that the entire operating framework goes into a courtroom for most of a decade, while the reservoirs keep doing whatever the hydrology tells them, and nobody knows what their allocation will be when it ends. That is why negotiators on both sides of Lee Ferry describe litigation as the failure case rather than the solution. Distance from the dam is not safety. It is a different mechanism and a less controllable one. There is one more thing worth understanding about how Arizona has absorbed this much already without a genuine emergency. Because it is the reason the state's cities are not in the position Rio Verde found itself in. Arizona built the legal machinery in 1980 with the Groundwater Management Act, which created active management areas covering Phoenix, Tucson, Prescott, and the Pinal Farming region with a stated goal of safe yield, putting as much water back into the aquifer as is pumped out of it. That law is why Arizona cities have a savings account. Groundwater banking works like this. In years when surface water is available, a city takes more than it immediately needs and puts the surplus into the ground, either spreading it in shallow basins to percolate down or injecting it through wells. Underground water does not evaporate. And evaporation off Lake Mead's surface runs to hundreds of thousands of acre-feet every year. It cannot be claimed by a downstream state. And it does not depend on a canal staying full. Tucson has been doing this since its aqueduct opened in 1993, recharging much of its Colorado River delivery rather than sending it straight to taps, including at a 226-acre recovery site in the southern Avra Valley. Combined with the native aquifer, that banked water amounts to something on the order of 47 years of supply at current use. The limits are just as real, and they matter for the point I am building to. Recovery is slower than opening a valve. It requires wells and treatment capacity built and paid for years in advance. And critically, every acre-foot of banked water has to be pumped back to the surface, which takes electricity. Now let me slow down because underneath all of this are people, and some of it has already happened. In Pinal County, between Phoenix and Tucson, farms in the same families for 3 and 4 generations have gone 3 consecutive years with no Colorado River allocation. Researchers using high-resolution satellite imagery can watch the priority system from orbit, neighboring irrigation districts, one holding junior rights and one holding senior tribal rights, showing up as fields going brown on one side of a line and staying green on the other. Agriculture consumes about 72% of Arizona's water, cities and towns 22%, industry 6%. So when you hear that Arizona's cities face a 14% cut in the years ahead, understand what was absorbed upstream of that number to keep it at 14%. In 2023, an unincorporated community called Rio Verde Foothills in Maricopa County lost its water outright. Homes had been built through lot splitting in a way that let a community be legally established without a documented supply. And residents bought hauled water routed through Scottsdale until Scottsdale ended the arrangement, having concluded it needed the water for its own residents. Households spent a winter buying water at sharply higher prices from further away. Phoenix's own water resources advisor has since cited Rio Verde as the outcome Arizona's cities are organizing to avoid repeating. And there are the tribes. Tribal water rights on the Colorado are among the most senior in the system, resting on a doctrine dating to 1908, and for most of the 20th century, they were not honored in practice. That has changed substantially, and it is why tribal users took no cuts in 2022, while farms across the fence went to zero. So let me close that loop, because this is the mechanism I most want you to take away. Hoover Dam's electricity is used in part to move Hoover Dam's water. The Colorado River aqueduct that carries water to Southern California does not flow downhill from Lake Havasu to Los Angeles. It has to be lifted, pumped over mountain ranges through a series of pumping plants before gravity can take it the rest of the way. That pumping is one of the largest single electrical loads in the region, and federal hydropower from the Colorado River system has historically supplied a substantial share of it, sold at rates below market. Now watch what happens as Lake Mead falls. A hydroelectric turbine's output depends on head, the vertical distance the water falls to reach it. As the reservoir surface drops, that distance shrinks, and the same volume of water passing through the same turbine produces less electricity. Hoover Dam has been generating measurably less power for years, and it is not because anybody turned anything down. It is because the lake got shorter. Meanwhile, the pumping load does not fall. The mountains are the same height. Lifting an acre-foot of water over them costs exactly what it always did. So a declining reservoir produces less of the cheap power that the system uses to move its own water, at the same time that shortage rules force water agencies to lean harder on alternatives, recovering banked groundwater, which also has to be pumped, or buying from other sources. The replacement power comes from the open market at market rates. That is why this reaches households as cost long before it reaches them as scarcity. Almost nobody in the Southwest is going to turn on a tap and find nothing. A great many of them are going to open a water bill and find a number they did not expect, and the chain that produced it runs from a snowpack in the Rockies, through a reservoir surface elevation, through a turbine's output, to a pumping plant, to a rate filing. Now to what happens next, because the deadlines are close and specific. The 2007 interim guidelines and the 2019 drought contingency plans expire at the end of this year. Despite negotiations running since at least 2022, the upper and lower basin states could not reach a consensus plan. And the Department of the Interior has released a federal framework of post-2026 rules for both reservoirs. The states were asked for the details of a preliminary agreement by mid-November, with a final 7-state agreement due by mid-February. The framework has a 2-stage structure. For 2027 and 2028, shortages up to 1,500. 0 acre-feet get divided by a proposal the 3 lower division states submitted on the 1st of May this year. Anything above that falls back to the priority system. From 2029, all shortages follow the priority system unless the states agree otherwise. In the federal modeling of a 1,500,000 acre-foot shortage in 2027 or 2028, Arizona gives up 760,000 acre-feet against California's 440,000. So here is what you can do with this. If you live in the basin, find out what your specific water provider's supply portfolio looks like. Not your states, not your metro areas, your providers. The difference between 70% Colorado River dependence and 100% is the difference between a rate increase and a crisis. And that figure is published in your utilities annual report or water resources plan. If you are buying property in central or southern Arizona, ask whether it has a designated or assured 100-year water supply and who the provider is. Rio Verde happened because homes were legally built without one. It is a documented, checkable status and the most important question about a house in that region that most buyers never ask. If you are anywhere served by Colorado River hydropower, watch your utilities rate filings this year rather than your water bill. That is where declining generation shows up first. And on conservation, outdoor use is where the volume is. In Arizona, up to 70% of residential water goes outside. Landscape, pools, vehicles. Southern Nevada's program, the most successful in the region, was built primarily on removing non-functional turf rather than on shower timers. That is where the savings live. So here is the bottom line, folks. Lake Mead, 1,041. 10 feet, 27% full, half a foot above the all-time record projected below it by December. Dead pool is 895 feet, 146 feet down. Hoover Dam stops generating around 950 feet, 91 feet down. Upstream, Lake Powell is 32 feet above its own power threshold, roughly 3 times closer than Hoover, having taken 2% of average inflow last month. With its release to Mead cut from 7,480,000 acre-feet to 6 million. 7 basin states and Mexico share a river divided in 1922 on an assumption of 15 million acre-feet the river does not produce. Under Tier 1, Arizona gives up 512,000 acre-feet, Mexico 80,000, Nevada 21,000, California nothing. Central Arizona Project Agriculture has been at 0 since 2023. The 4 upper basin states take no lower basin cuts and face curtailment if Lee Ferry cannot be met. And Las Vegas holds an intake 35 feet below the level at which Hoover Dam stops working entirely. The specific thing worth watching is not Hoover. It is Lake Powell's 32 feet, because Glen Canyon loses its turbines long before Hoover loses anything, and when it does. The pressure to hold water upstream gets harder to resist, which means less arriving at Lake Mead. After that, the next date is mid-November, when the 7 states owe the details of a preliminary agreement. If those deadlines hold, the cuts land in ranges the cities can absorb. If they do not, the fallback is the priority system downstream and litigation upstream. Those are the 2 published paths, and that is not a prediction. It is what the documents say. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe and turn notifications on, because I track this system and these numbers move every single week. And to the farmers in Pinal County who have gone 3 years without an allocation, to the families in Rio Verde who spent a winter hauling water, and to everyone across 3 states and northern Mexico who is about to find out what a shorter lake does to a power bill, you are not being